Hi guys, welcome back to another video here today. Well, Happy New Year, by the way, as well. Today I am reviewing Andrey Platonov's The Foundation Pit. Platonov is a really great writer. I think I've mentioned him before. I must have reviewed a book of his short stories. He's a really great writer of the Stalinist era. And the reason I thought to do a video right now was I bought some more Pepsi Zero Sugar and made me think of you fellows. So, excellent book. So if you know anything about the Stalinist era, Russian history, Russian literary history, any of that stuff, it's an aid to understanding this book. I read that this was described as a surrealist example of, what was it, Marxist or Soviet surrealism. Not 100% sure on the definition of that, but I think I reviewed Master and Margarita by, was it Bulgakov, a couple years ago, and if this book is surrealist, then I'd say Master and Margarita is too. Both are communist era, Stalinist era books, and I don't know what makes them qualify as surrealist, but there you have it. So it's the story is set obviously in Stalinist Russia, and specifically the era of the liquidation of the upper class peasantry, the kulaks. So kulaks were the most successful peasants, and in order to make the revolution succeed outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Lenin and Stalin had to divide and conquer the peasantry, because the peasantry didn't know anything about Marxism. They didn't care about anything like that. They were very traditionalist. Just like even in Canada and the US, the political divide in these countries is basically, as you know, it's a rural and urban divide. The rural areas are much more conservative, and the urban areas are much more liberal or progressive. And the Russian Revolution basically occurred exclusively in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the two capitals, as they called them. And it didn't really matter initially what happened anywhere else. And that was why the Russian Revolution, it took a little while, because there were supporters of the old regime, of the Tsarist regime, collecting in different parts outside of the capitals. The white Russians or whatever, not white Russians, but the white army versus the red army, right? So this book takes place in the rural setting, and features concludes basically with the expulsion of the kulaks from a certain area, certain village, certain area, right? The first half of the book, or more than for first half of the book, mostly concentrates on a few committed communists, few committed followers of Stalin and the communist regime. And it's extremely interesting to see their commitment to the ideology, and being on the outskirts of Russia, where the intelligentsia haven't, these are the most uneducated people in Russia, and which was a very backward country at the time in terms of education and so on. Um, it's really interesting to see if Platonov is in any way accurate, and he was a supporter. He was a committed communist, but he was honest enough to look at the actual situation around him, right? So some of the some of the main characters are very committed to Stalin's cause, and basically it's analysis, or not an analysis, but a presentation of their, basically, I can't find a better word for it, but their religious commitment to Stalinism. It's fascinating. Like, if you've read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Turgenev, any of the major writers from the golden age of Russian literature in the 19th century, the peasants are presented as a very uneducated but very religious, superstitious, old-fashioned people. And it's so interesting how basically the communist revolution amounts to simply going from one religion to another religion. And I think it's important to say that many of the writers and intellectuals that we admire were supporters of the regime initially, or the, I should say, the revolution, like Platonov was, Solzhenitsyn was, Gorky was. I don't know about Bulgakov, but anyway, and this is important because it speaks of the appeal that the revolution had for them, the alienation of the lower class outside of the power structure of the Russian empire, the imperial administration. It was still a very aristocratic regime where your class meant everything, right? So when you have the birth of the spread of literacy, the spread of education, the spread of technology, which should say, well, of industry, which makes, which sort of, it doesn't keep wealth necessarily inside the old power structure, right? Of counts and dukes and the old aristocracy of land ownership. But any enterprising industrialist can come along and make a fortune, and with fortune comes power, and this is power that pushes against the old power structures, right? So if you take, for instance, if you take England, for example, modern day England and the House of Lords, the House of Lords is composed with hereditary members from the aristocracy, from the nobility, and it's composed of members outside. So for instance, the one-time, I guess he's still Canadian, Conrad Black, who was very wealthy Canadian / British newspaper person. He was a member of the House of Lords, and then the Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who hated him. What did he do? Basically, what did he do? Revoked his citizenship or something of Canada or something like that. Anyway, so the House of Lords today and the House of Commons in England is kind of an integration of the old aristocracy with the new aristocracy of industry and wealth, right? And people like Elton John, Paul McCartney, these people are elevated to, are knighted and so on. So this is the British way of incorporating new power with old power, right? But there was no such avenue adopted in Russia in at the end of the 18th, or sorry, end of the 19th and start of the 20th century. It was an attempted sort of like a Hail Mary pass when they had, for a very short period of time, a constitutional monarchy, which put elected sort of an elected parliament alongside the Tsar, but the radicals, especially the Marxists, the communists, didn't let that happen. And so if it's one thing you'll notice in the writings of Dostoevsky, you'll notice it in some of Tolstoy's, for instance, his later novel Resurrection. Trying to think what else. Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. The Devils by Dostoevsky is a great example. The discontentment of the lower classes, especially the urban lower classes. So we're not talking about the peasantry. We're talking about the people who flooded to Moscow especially, but St. Petersburg as well. And these were the urban poor who, as you know, are typically the agents of revolution, right? That was the case in Paris. That was the case over and over again in Rome, of course, and obviously in Russia as well. It's the city when the 1848 revolutions all over Europe, the Spanish revolutions and all that stuff. So we have this class of disenfranchised, educated, discontent people. So the success of the Russian Revolution was that the Marxists were very, very energetic proselytizers, and one of their greatest successes was in the army. So when the army is in World War One, there's basically being slaughtered and so on by the Germans, the Marxists really riled up the lower class, the poor and so on, against their commanders and so on. So and the sailors in the naval base by St. Petersburg were instrumental in the success of the revolution. And so these disenfranchised soldiers and urban poor were the forces behind the revolution, which is great. It conquered the cities, but the countryside was another matter, as I said. And so here, Platonov, who I think he's definitely from outside of the capitals. I want to say he's from south somewhere, but I can't remember exactly. But he's presenting, as I said, this rural thing. And what we have here is a very interesting instance of the ongoing revolution, which is here is we have basically, there's being built here, the foundation pit of a building, right? So the foundation of a building is being laid, which is a metaphor also, obviously, for the building of communism and so on. But nearby, so attention is focused on that work, and then eventually they have quotas, and they have to liquidate the kulaks, and they have to bring the peasantry into state-run farms, right? So the free peasantry has to be brought into state-run farms, and initially they have no interest in that because, why would you want to give up your private land, your private farm or whatever? And so the last big scene is, as I said, the kulaks. So in the sub-kulaks, the wealthiest, most successful peasants are literally put on a barge and sent down the river. They say to the sea. I don't know. Is that the Black Sea? I assume it's the Black Sea. It could be the Mediterranean. No, it must be the Black Sea. So that's extremely interesting. Like in histories of the Russian Revolution, most attention is obviously paid on the dramatic events in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and what's going on in the countryside isn't talked about as much because isn't studied as much, isn't photographed as much, isn't the important people weren't out there, so we don't, historians don't pay as much attention. So here we have a snapshot of this rural communization, and commune means common, obviously. So basically it's taking all the private ownership away from the peasantry, which is something they cherish most of all, right? Because just 50 years earlier, they were owned people, they were serfs, and so there's only a couple generations where the peasants could own land and so on, and not be owned themselves by the nobility. So here we have this disappropriation and collectivization, what they call it, collectivization, right, of the peasantry. And so that's interesting in itself, but of course what's interesting is looking inside the souls of these supporters of the regime. So all the main characters are more or less party members, enthusiastic Stalinists, and to see the nihilism, the disenchantment, the switch from Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, to Marxist atheism. One of the characters, very briefly, is a priest. One of the minor characters, I should say. And so that stuff is all extremely interesting. And just as a side note, right now I'm reading Arthur Clarke's Childhood's End, and that's about transition as well, and like the transition of, you know, your fundamental understandings of the world, and that touches on the subject of the loss of religious faith, and so does the Foundation Pit. So to have read them at the same time was really interesting, and talking about the loss of your basic cardinal orientation, your cardinal points of your understanding of the world, the disorientation that happens when people's fundamental understanding of the world just evaporates. So it's an extremely interesting book, but one thing I have to say is that if you don't understand any of the history of Russia, there's a pretty cool what do they call it, afterword, written by the editor or translators of this book, which I would suggest reading first if you don't know any of the history involved here, any of the special terms or anything like that. I would read that first, because even me, who's read tons of Russian history and tons of Russian literature, I found myself at times saying, well, how much of this is real and how much of this is like fantasy or metaphor or something. And I guess that's what surrealism means. It means real, but something beyond that too. So it's a very interesting book. I really enjoyed it, but I caution you that you might not understand it or be able to enjoy it because you don't understand it. I mean, I don't understand everything about it, but again, knew enough about it anyway. I really enjoy Platonov. The short stories and stuff that I've read of his are just really quite just wonderful, and reading the stuff on Platonov a bit here. This work has only come into being read in the last couple decades, because obviously the communist authorities don't love sharing works that are critical, or not necessarily critical, but artistically critical, reflective of the communist regime. So these works are slowly becoming popularized, and I can't remember, but again, this has only been in English translation a fairly short while, so that's kind of cool. I love Platonov, couldn't recommend him highly enough. But again, you got to know some Russian history especially Russian history of the revolution, to understand this book. But Platonov, once again, is able to present the human soul in just a fascinating way. He doesn't elaborate on it like, say, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, but he presents it in a rawness and in an intriguing manner, very simply, and that's really quite something. So he's doing these brush strokes, which are very effective, right? And at unveiling the hidden recesses of the soul that might be surprising to us, right? So that's all I got to say today. I hope you guys have a great 2024. I was so psyched that I'm up to 300 subscribers now, and I'll keep trying to deliver stuff that'll make even more people want to subscribe. Thanks guys so much.